When we speak about conflict, it's easy, perhaps too easy, to drift into language of strategy, territory, and power.
We hear numbers, we hear statements, we hear justifications. But behind every number is a name, behind every statistic is a story, and behind every story is a human being whose life has been irreversibly altered.
And if we lose sight of that, if we allow ourselves to become numb to that reality, then we have already lost something far greater than any political struggle. We have lost our humanity. Think for a moment not in terms of borders or headlines, but in terms of ordinary life.
A parent waking up in the morning, hoping simply to provide safety and stability for their children. A child dreaming about school, about friends, about a future that feels secure. These are universal experiences.
They transcend language, culture, and geography. And yet, in times of conflict, these simple, shared hopes are the very first to be shattered.
What does it mean for a child to grow up surrounded not by opportunity, but by fear? What does it mean for families to live with uncertainty, not knowing if their homes will still stand tomorrow? These are not abstract questions, they are lived realities. And when we reflect on them sincerely, we begin to understand that the true cost of conflict is not measured in political gains or losses. It is measured in broken lives, in lost childhoods, in futures that will never be realized. There is a danger in becoming desensitized. When suffering is repeated enough times on our screens, it risks becoming background noise. But we cannot allow that to happen. We must resist the urge to look away, to scroll past, to accept it as just the way things are. Because the moment we accept that, we normalize injustice. And the moment we normalize injustice, we contribute silently, indirectly, but meaningfully to its Arabic, Alif Arabic, Sin Arabic, Ta Arabic, Meme Arabic, Rot Arabic, Alif Arabic, Rot. Every life carries equal weight. This is not a slogan, it is a principle that must guide our moral compass. No child's tears are less significant because of where they were born. No parent's grief is less painful because of their nationality. When we begin to rank human suffering, when we allow ourselves to feel more for some and less for others, we fracture the very foundation of justice. And so, the question we must ask ourselves is not which side is winning, but rather who is suffering and how do we stop it. Because at the end of the day, history will not remember us kindly for our arguments if those arguments came at the expense of compassion. It will not praise us for our silence when we had the opportunity to speak for those who could not. We must also recognize that the wounds of conflict do not end when the noise fades, trauma lingers. It embeds itself in the hearts and minds of those who have lived through it. A child who grows up in fear does not simply forget that fear when peace is declared. It shapes their world, their sense of trust, their ability to hope. Entire generations can carry the scars of what they have witnessed long after the world has moved on to the next headline. This is why the human cost must remain at the center of every conversation. Not as an afterthought, not as a footnote, but as the starting point. Because when we begin with humanity, we are more likely to end with justice. When we begin with empathy, we are more likely to pursue solutions that preserve life rather than destroy it. And let us be clear, caring about human suffering is not a sign of weakness. It is not naivety, it is strength. It is the recognition that true power lies not in domination, but in compassion. It is the understanding that lasting peace cannot be built on the ruins of human dignity. So as we continue this conversation, as we reflect on what must be done and where we go from here, let us anchor ourselves in this simple, undeniable truth. Every life matters, and every moment of suffering demands our attention. Because if we fail to center the human cost, then no matter what outcome we reach, we will have lost what mattered most. If we are sincere in our concern for human suffering, then we cannot stop at emotion alone. Compassion, while essential, must be guided by principles that ensure justice is not selective and accountability is not negotiable. This is where the role of international law becomes not just relevant, but indispensable. Because without a framework that holds all parties to the same standard, even the most heartfelt calls for peace risk becoming empty words. International law, at its core, is built on a simple yet profound idea that even in times of conflict, there are limits. There are lines that must not be crossed, protections that must not be violated, and rights that must not be stripped away. These are not arbitrary rules, they are the collective wisdom of humanity shaped by the painful lessons of history. They exist because the world has seen, time and time again, what happens when power operates without restraint. But the challenge we face is not the absence of these laws, it is the inconsistency in their application. Too often, accountability becomes selective. Too often, violations are acknowledged when convenient and ignored when uncomfortable. And this inconsistency erodes trust not only in institutions, but in the very idea of justice itself. Because justice that is applied unevenly is not justice at all, it is merely power disguised as principle. We must be honest enough to recognize that holding one side accountable while excusing another does not resolve conflict. It deepens it. It sends a message that some lives are protected by law, while others are left vulnerable to its absence. And when people feel that the system meant to protect them is failing, frustration turns into anger, and anger, if left unaddressed, can spiral into further instability. Accountability, therefore, must be universal. It must transcend alliances, politics, and narratives. It must be rooted in the understanding that no cause, no matter how strongly believed in, justifies the violation of fundamental human rights. Because the moment we allow ends to justify means, we open the door to endless cycles of harm, each side convinced of its own righteousness, each side perpetuating the very suffering it claims to oppose. And let us reflect for a moment on what accountability truly means. It is not about punishment for the sake of punishment. It is about recognition. It is about acknowledging that harm has been done, that lives have been affected, and that those responsible must answer for their actions. It is about restoring a sense of dignity to those who have been wronged, assuring them that their pain is neither invisible nor ignored. At the same time, accountability is also a pathway to prevention. When there are real consequences for violations, it creates a deterrent. It signals that the world is watching, that actions have weight, and that there are boundaries that cannot be crossed without repercussions. In this way, accountability is not only about addressing the past, it is about protecting the future. But for this to work, there must be sincerity. There must be a genuine commitment from the international community to uphold these standards consistently, not just when it aligns with political interests, but especially when it challenges them. Because the credibility of any system is measured not by how it operates in easy moments, but by how it holds firm in difficult ones. This is where collective responsibility comes into play. Governments, institutions, and individuals all have a role to play in reinforcing these principles. It is not enough to express concern, there must be action. It is not enough to call for justice, there must be a willingness to pursue it even when it is inconvenient. Because silence in the face of clear violations is not neutrality, it is complicity. And yet, even as we emphasize accountability, we must remain mindful of our ultimate goal. The purpose is not to prolong conflict, but to resolve it. The purpose is not to assign blame endlessly, but to create conditions where harm is less likely to occur. This balance is delicate, but it is necessary. Justice and peace are not opposing forces. When pursued correctly, they reinforce one another. If we truly believe in the value of every human life, then we must also believe in the systems that protect those lives. And we must be willing to demand that those systems function as they were intended fairly, consistently, and without bias. Because without accountability, there can be no trust, and without trust, there can be no lasting peace. So, as we move forward, let us not shy away from this responsibility. Let us not allow principles to be diluted by convenience or overshadowed by politics. Let us stand firm in the belief that justice must be universal, that accountability must be unwavering, and that the rule of law must apply to all without exception. Because in the absence of accountability, the cycle of suffering does not end, it simply repeats. If we accept that the human cost is unbearable, and if we agree that accountability must be upheld, then the question that naturally follows is this: where do we go from here? Because recognizing suffering and demanding justice, while necessary, are not the end of the conversation. They are the beginning. What ultimately matters is whether we can move from a cycle of pain to a path of resolution, from escalation to de-escalation, from despair to something that resembles hope. And this is not an easy transition. It requires a shift not only in policy, but in mindset, because conflict, once it reaches a certain intensity, has a way of feeding itself. Every act becomes a justification for another. Every grievance becomes a reason to continue. And in that environment, the idea of stepping back, of choosing restraint, can feel almost counterintuitive. Yet it is precisely at that moment that restraint becomes most necessary. De-escalation does not mean ignoring injustice. It does not mean silencing legitimate concerns or abandoning the pursuit of accountability. Rather, it means recognizing that continued escalation will only multiply the suffering we have already acknowledged. It means understanding that even the most justified cause can lose its moral grounding if it perpetuates harm without end. This is where the concept of a ceasefire becomes so important, not as a final solution, but as a pause, a moment to breathe, to reassess, to prevent further loss of life. Because without that pause, meaningful dialogue becomes nearly impossible. When people are in survival mode, when fear dominates every thought, there is little room left for negotiation or compromise. But a ceasefire alone is not enough. It must be accompanied by a genuine commitment to dialogue, and dialogue, if it is to be effective, requires more than just words. It requires a willingness to listen, not to respond, not to argue, but to truly understand the concerns, the fears, and the aspirations of the other side. This is difficult. It challenges deeply held beliefs. It forces us to confront perspectives that may be uncomfortable. But without this willingness, dialogue becomes little more than a formality. We must also recognize the role of mediation. In situations where trust has been eroded, where direct communication is strained or even impossible, the presence of neutral parties can make a significant difference. Mediators can help create space for conversation, ensure that discussions remain focused, and provide a level of assurance that the process is being conducted fairly. Their role is not to impose solutions, but to facilitate them. And then there is diplomacy, the quiet, often unseen work that happens behind the scenes. It may not capture headlines, and it may not provide immediate results, but it is essential, because lasting solutions are rarely achieved through sudden breakthroughs. They are built gradually, through careful negotiation, through compromise, through a series of steps that, taken together, move the situation forward. Compromise, of course, is one of the most challenging aspects of this process. It requires each side to accept that they may not achieve everything they want. It requires a recognition that holding on to absolute positions may prolong the conflict indefinitely. And yet, compromise should not be seen as weakness. It should be understood as pragmatism, the recognition that partial progress is better than perpetual suffering. At the same time, any pathway to peace must be rooted in fairness. Solutions that ignore the legitimate rights and needs of one side are unlikely to endure. They may create a temporary calm, but beneath the surface, tensions will remain, waiting for the next spark. True peace requires that all parties feel that their dignity has been acknowledged, that their voices have been heard, and that their future holds some measure of security. This is why inclusivity matters. Peace processes that exclude key voices, whether they are communities, leaders, or stakeholders, risk overlooking critical perspectives. And those overlooked perspectives can become sources of future instability. Ensuring that the process is as inclusive as possible increases the likelihood that the outcome will be both accepted and sustained. We must also be patient. In a world that often seeks immediate results, it is important to remember that deep-rooted conflicts do not resolve overnight. There will be setbacks, there will be moments of frustration, but progress, even if slow, is still progress. What matters is the direction, and throughout all of this, we must keep returning to the central principle that has guided us from the beginning, the value of human life. Every decision, every negotiation, every compromise must be measured against this principle. Does it reduce suffering? Does it protect lives? Does it create conditions where future generations can live without fear? Because at the end of the day, the goal is not simply to end a conflict. It is to build a peace that is strong enough to endure, just enough to be respected, and compassionate enough to heal. And that begins the moment we choose dialogue over destruction. And as we reflect on the human cost, and we insist on accountability, and we search sincerely for pathways to peace, we arrive at a final, unavoidable realization: none of this exists in isolation. No conflict today is truly contained within borders. The world we live in is deeply interconnected economically, politically, and even morally. What happens in one region reverberates far beyond it, and that means responsibility, too, cannot be confined to a single place or a single people. It is shared. There is a tendency, especially from a distance, to view conflicts as something external, something tragic, yes, but ultimately removed from our daily lives. We watch, we react, we feel a surge of emotion, and then we return to our routines. But if we are honest, we must ask ourselves, is that enough? Is awareness without action sufficient in the face of prolonged suffering? Because history has shown us that silence, even when unintentional, can allow injustice to persist far longer than it should. Global responsibility begins with recognition. It begins with acknowledging that we are not mere spectators. Whether through our governments, our institutions, or our own individual choices, we are connected to the systems that shape outcomes. And with that connection comes a degree of accountability, not in the same sense as those directly involved in the conflict, but in the sense that we have the capacity to influence, to advocate, and to support. Governments, for example, play a crucial role. Their policies, their alliances, and their decisions carry weight on the international stage. When they choose to support peace-building efforts, to encourage dialogue, and to uphold international law consistently, they contribute to an environment where resolution becomes more possible. But when their actions are driven solely by strategic interests, without regard for human consequences, they risk reinforcing the very dynamics that perpetuate conflict. This is why public awareness matters, because governments do not operate in a vacuum. They respond, in part, to the voices of their citizens. When people speak out, peacefully, thoughtfully, and persistently, they can shape the priorities of those in power. This is not an abstract idea. It is a reality that has been demonstrated time and time again. Collective voices, when sustained and focused, can lead to meaningful change. Organizations, too, have a significant role. Humanitarian groups provide essential aid, food, medical care, shelter to those affected by conflict.
Their work is often carried out under extremely difficult conditions, yet it serves as a lifeline for countless individuals.
Supporting these efforts, whether through funding, volunteering, or advocacy, is one of the most direct ways to alleviate suffering. But beyond institutions and governments, there is the individual, and it is easy to underestimate the impact of individual action. We may feel that our voices are too small, our contributions too limited to make a difference. Yet when multiplied across communities, across societies, these individual efforts accumulate. They create momentum, they shift narratives, they remind the world that concern for human dignity is not confined to a select few, it is shared. At the same time, we must be careful about how we engage. In an age of instant information, it is easy for discussions to become polarized, for conversations to turn into arguments, for empathy to be replaced by hostility. But if our goal is to contribute to peace, then our approach must reflect that goal. We must strive to be informed, to seek out credible information, and to engage in ways that foster understanding rather than division. This does not mean avoiding difficult conversations. On the contrary, it means approaching them with sincerity and respect. It means being willing to listen as much as we speak, to challenge ideas without dehumanizing those who hold them, and to remain focused on the broader objective, reducing suffering and promoting justice. There is also a long-term dimension to global responsibility. Beyond immediate responses, there is a need to invest in systems that prevent conflicts from escalating in the first place. This includes supporting education, promoting economic stability, and encouraging cross-cultural dialogue. These may seem like distant goals, but they address the underlying conditions that often contribute to unrest. And perhaps most importantly, global responsibility requires consistency. It is not enough to care in moments of crisis and then forget when attention shifts elsewhere. True commitment means maintaining focus, continuing to advocate, and remaining engaged even when the issue is no longer in the spotlight. Because for those directly affected, the reality does not disappear when the headlines do. As we bring all of this together, we are reminded that the pursuit of peace is not the responsibility of one group alone. It is a shared endeavor. It requires coordination, cooperation, and a willingness to look beyond immediate interests toward a more just and stable future. And while the challenges are significant, so too is the potential for collective impact. When governments act with integrity, when organizations operate with compassion, and when individuals engage with sincerity, the combined effect can be transformative. So the question is not whether we have a role to play, the question is whether we are willing to embrace it. Because in a connected world, responsibility shared is the only path to peace sustained.